Yesterday, President Biden said it's up to Congress to deliver gun control reform in the wake of last week's Uvalde school shooting, telling reporters, quote, "I can't dictate this stuff. I can do the things I've done, and any executive action I can take, I'll continue to take, but I can't outlaw a weapon. I can't change a background check. I can't do that." This is over 30 people were shot and killed this Memorial Day weekend across the country.
Igor Volsky, executive director of Guns Down America, criticized the White House's decision not to disrupt reform negotiations in the Senate, writing, quote, "The argument that building public support for very popular gun violence prevention reform will somehow make Republicans feel less pressure to make a deal is absurd. It's an excuse for inaction. Democrats are always afraid of their own shadows. Voters see this as a weakness." Igor is with us now as part of our Rising panel. We're also joined by David French, senior editor for The Dispatch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Igor, it does seem to me that Democrats have a very different posture about this than Republicans do when there is this kind of national consensus about the failure of both gun laws, barriers to people accessing guns that are used so often in these kinds of instances, and also police reform more broadly. It's hard to imagine that Republicans really wouldn't push that messaging through and try to gain some ground here in the public discourse. What do you think is going on with the Democrats right now?
Well, it's very, I think, unhelpful for the president to get in front of cameras and tell voters what he can't do. What he should be doing is laying out tangible steps that he and his administration are taking. So everything from opening a first ever White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention that could really coordinate this work across government to actually rolling up his sleeves and trying to get a deal. You'll remember he ran for president promising us that his 30 years of Senate experience gave him unique tools to bring Republicans and Democrats together to get tough things done. Why he's not, putting those skills to the test and is instead outsourcing everything and acting as a bystander, I just don't understand.
Yeah, David, what do you think? And I know you've criticized, for instance, the NRA, which just had its meeting and kept Wayne LaPierre in power despite all the various scandals, financial scandals he's involved in. You've been critical of a lot of what the gun lobby does and says. At the same time, I can't help but think that there is not actually that nearly as much public support for the kinds of really sweeping gun measures that might actually make some difference. And in fact, there's already a lot of gun laws that exist that are not being enforced enough, that we have a lot of homicides being committed with guns that are already illegal and not a lot being done about that.
Yeah, well, two things. First, National Retail Federation, David French, is a different David French, and he gets my Twitter hate sometimes. So we don't want to confuse those two David Frenches. Second thing, with the NRA and Wayne LaPierre, little relationship advice: find somebody who loves you as unconditionally as the NRA board apparently loves Wayne LaPierre. He can do no wrong for them. Third, look, when it comes to gun regulation, when it comes to the problem of mass shootings, we often focus on things that 50 years of study indicates isn't really material to the mass shooting issue. So if you look at 50 years of study, there was a National Institutes for Justice funded study that came out. And how sad is it that we have 50 years of study of mass shootings now? What they find is 80% or more of guns are around 80% of guns used in mass shootings are purchased legally. About 80% of guns used in mass shootings are handguns, not assault weapons like an AR-15 style weapon. But in the majority of mass shootings, what happens is people leak their plans. They broadcast their plans for what they intend to do. One of the reasons why I've advocated for red flag laws, for example, that allow police to seize weapons up with a court order when someone has indicated that they're a threat to themselves or others. And effective implementation of red flag laws could have prevented a host of mass shootings. And we also have to take each gun violence issue and gun death issue on and understand the different categories. So the gun crime issue is different from the suicide issue, which is different from the more normal gun crime issue, I should say, is different from the suicide issue, which is very different from the mass shooter issue, and different problems require different remedies. And that's one of the reasons why I've been very vocal in advocating these red flag laws, which are tied directly to the research of what we know, not just about mass shootings, by the way, but also about suicides.
And it does seem that in the wake of Uvalde, there has been a greater attention to the kinds of flags that people have been putting up on Facebook or other kinds of social media. And there were a number of incidences that were intercepted over the course of just the last 5 days. In a piece republished by Bari Weiss's Common Sense newsletter, David, you criticized Uvalde police officers' response to last week's shooting in light of Memorial Day, writing, quote, "Our nation is sustained by sacrifice. It is strained and stained by cowardice. May the shame of Uvalde shake us from our national malaise. May the memory of our fallen call us back to our highest ideals, and may God have mercy on us all." You know, how much should this idea of kind of individual courage play into this? Because some might say, you know, this is a real systemic failure, and it's not necessarily about the goodness or badness of any individual, but obviously choices were made on a higher level, the commander making the decision to categorize the event as a barricade event as opposed to an active shooter event that seemed to have all of these trickle-down effects. How do you see cowardice and kind of these systemic factors playing out against each other?
You know, look, at one point at 11:35 a.m., which is, I believe, about 2 to 3 minutes after the actual shooting started inside the school, there were seven officers outside the location where the shooter was. He wasn't really barricaded. He was just behind a locked door. Mm-hmm. Seven officers. Now, 2 had been lightly injured by grazing gunshot wounds, but the training that the New York Times found the training, or reported on the training that Uvalde police had received for mass shooting incidents. And the training was quite clear. Even if it's just one officer, even if it's just one, you keep going, you keep pressing on. They had 7, and then it turned into 8, and then to 9. And then eventually some reports say 19 officers huddled outside those classrooms where the shooter was holed up. And at that same time, there were at least two little girls who called 911 from inside the classroom begging for help. There were classmates dead and dying around them. This was a failure of the first order. Now, yes, there were some command and control failures, absolutely. But one thing that I want to know is when there were 7 officers at 11:35, they had a decision to make. And they made the wrong decision. And it is now widely acknowledged that the wrong call was made. And look, I know full well that's a terrifying thing. It is a terrifying thing to try to burst through a door when you know on the other side is a man with a rifle. But that is what the training requires. That is what the uniform, quite frankly, requires. And we need a thorough investigation of how this happened, because from 11:35 to the final breach at 12:50 was 1 hour and 15 minutes, and that's absolutely stunning.
Igor, I want to bring you back in here and switch gears a little bit. What is the kind of legislation that you would like to see? And Bree and I have both mentioned, or she brought up sort of Australia's success with gun buyback program. What do you make of that idea, or what legislative remedy are you looking for?
Well, look, I think the legislative remedies here aren't some mystery, right? You could look at the Australia example. You could look at countries around the world that have very successfully reduced not just their homicide rate, but also have really cut down on mass shootings, have made those mass shootings less deadly. And this is everything from background checks to licensing to registration to really limiting the kind of firearms that are available to civilian populations, to regulating the industry far more heavily than we do here in the United States, and to investing in communities, particularly those that experience high rates of gun violence. We know from real world experience that these things work. And to David's point about the fact that a lot of these guns that are used in mass shootings are obtained legally, I think that's precisely the point. The laws need to change, and I would argue that the standard of firearm ownership in the United States needs to be increased.
Yeah, the question of whether or not to raise the age, I mean, when we're talking about criminal justice reform, generally speaking, there's an understanding that incidents of criminality diminish enormously at a certain age. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but basically as men move into middle age, they stop committing crimes. And when you see the motivation of some of these younger shooters being tied to their schooling and this effort to go back to this side of high school, oftentimes talking about the poor treatment they feel like they received in high school, frustration about girl troubles we saw in some of the manifesto from Santa Barbara, things like that, it does make me wonder whether or not simply raising the age of access to these guns would at least curb some of the school-oriented shootings. I don't know, what do you make of that, Igor?
Yeah, no, I think that's a start, but I also take David's point, and I've always been happy to hear that he supports red flag laws or emergency risk protection orders, laws that are designed to keep guns out of the hands of people who are likely to hurt themselves or those around them. That's important, and to the degree that there are some negotiations happening now in the Senate, maybe we could get to some kind of deal around that piece. But again, my argument here is that we need real systemic change, that the question of what we do is not any kind of mystery. It's really just the matter of, do we have leaders currently in power who want to spend and invest actual political capital towards making progress towards that kind of reform?
David, on the red flag question, you voiced support for tweeting that one of the virtues of the law is it gives citizens an alternative when the police fail. Family members or school officials can go to a judge on their own, secure an order requiring cops to seize guns from a dangerous man. And I think that's pretty key because in so many of these school shooter situations, we later find out that people saw the signs and they spoke up. They didn't keep it to themselves. Right. They alerted law enforcement. In Parkland, the number of reports to the sheriff department, to the FBI knew about it. This was clearly a violent individual, and people didn't stand back and do nothing. They spoke up like they were supposed to, and it didn't make a difference because the police didn't handle it correctly. They mishandled it in a slightly different way than what we saw here. We saw a different kind of mishandling. But explain a little bit more about the red flag process.
Yeah, so essentially what happens with a red flag law is if you're an individual has the ability, standing to seek an order, say a family member, a school official, an employer, and the police often in red flag laws have the ability to seek a red flag order. What you can do is you can go to court, just very similar to a process for a domestic violence restraining order that people are very used to in this country. Very, very similar process. You can go to a court and you can seek an order from the court requiring the police to go seize a gun upon a proper showing of need, upon a proper passing of a burden of proof. And the advantage here is Robbie, just like you noted in the Parkland situation, investigations after the Parkland shooting indicated that the shooter had been people that called more than 3 dozen calls had been made from the shooter's house to the police or about the shooter's house to the police. This is a person who'd been on the radar screen of the police for a long time. If you look at the Uvalde shooter, this is somebody that we're beginning to get reports. Mm-hmm. Police had been to his house. He had rode around town shooting at people with BB guns. There were all kinds of red flags radiating from this individual. And there are 2 things that Florida did. And Florida's a state that protects Second Amendment rights. But there are 2 things that Florida did after the Parkland shooting: raise the age to purchase a rifle and implement a red flag law. And since Florida has implemented red flag laws, thousands of people who've demonstrated dangerous behavior have been subject to red flag orders. There's a couple of thousand red flag orders in place right now in Florida. This is a tool that when people know it exists, that's a key, they have to know it exists, but when people know it exists, they can use to protect their families, to protect their schools, to protect their workplaces.
Well, David, Igor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.